They called her the has-been. Not to her face, never to her face, but in the break-room conversations that stopped the moment she entered, in the way residents avoided her during case reviews, in the careful distance staff maintained like she was contagious with failure. Hannah Clarke heard it in the silence more than in words. 3 years since the medical discharge from Kandahar had turned her into a different kind of soldier, the kind who clocked in through a civilian ER entrance instead of a military hospital. She didn't know that Dr. Caldwell had already decided what she was. She didn't know his phone call to the board would come before the week ended. What happened in the next 48 hours would prove both of them catastrophically wrong. The night shift began like every night shift, with the smell of antiseptic and coffee that had been brewing since morning. Hannah arrived at Seattle General's ER in Philadelphia 20 minutes early, a habit she'd never broken from 12 years of military discipline. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant frequency, a sound she'd learned to filter out the way other nurses learned to ignore monitor beeps. She moved through the corridors with the efficiency of someone rebuilding from ruins, her scrubs hanging loose enough to hide the shrapnel scars mapping her abdomen like a topographical chart of Kandahar embedded under her skin. Her left leg compensated for the IED blast that had ended her career, a slight limp she'd perfected over 3 years to seem unremarkable, just a tired night shift nurse with a minor gait issue, nothing that would draw attention or questions. The ER was moderately full. 8 patients in beds, 3 waiting in chairs, 1 drunk college kid throwing up in the bathroom. Standard Tuesday night. Hannah clocked in at 18:38 and headed straight for supply room 3, where the crash cart sat like a resting piece of machinery. She began her pre-shift inventory with movements that could have been choreographed by a surgeon. Airways arranged by size: 2.5 endotracheal tube, 3.0, 3.5, 4.0, each one positioned for single-hand access if the code ran hot and she needed to intubate while compressions continued. For kits in reach sequence. Chest seals, the improvised kind made from MRE wrappers that she'd learned to fold in the field, the plastic worn soft from handling across 1,000 practice repetitions. She kept an actual wrapper in her jacket pocket, the one hanging in her locker, creased from handling, a habit she couldn't break even after 3 years of peacetime employment. The charge nurse, Melissa, stopped by the crash cart and watched Hannah work. "You organize that weird but it works," Melissa said, which was Melissa's way of saying everything was in order. Most nurses would arrange supplies by manufacturer preference or cost efficiency. Hannah arranged them by survival probability and speed of access during cardiac arrest. She'd learned the system in a combat surgical hospital outside Jalalabad where 3 seconds between reaching for equipment and deploying it could decide who made it home and who didn't. Hannah nodded without speaking. The fluorescent lights caught the movement and cast a shadow across her jaw, which had tightened almost imperceptibly. She was used to comments about her organizational style, her precision, the way she moved during codes like someone following a blueprint only she could see. She was also used to not explaining herself. Explanation required trust, and trust required revealing the patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the faded Special Forces unit insignia she touched each shift before clocking in, a ritual that grounded her in who she'd been before Philadelphia, before Seattle General, before she'd learned to make herself smaller. Dr. Caldwell arrived for evening rounds at 1923 wearing a white coat crisp enough to cut glass. He moved through the ER like he owned the building, which, in terms of institutional power, he effectively did. As chief of surgery, he controlled budget allocations, staff assignments, and the subtle network of board connections that determined whose career progressed and who stalled. He'd built his reputation on surgical precision and rigid protocols. The precision was genuine. The protocols were primarily a mechanism of control, a way of weaponizing procedure into absolute dominance over anyone beneath him in the hierarchy. He stopped at Trauma Bay 2, where a 38-year-old male with acute appendicitis was being prepped for surgery. A second-year resident, Dr. Marcus Webb, was inserting a central line to establish better vascular access before transport to the OR. The insertion was textbook correct, needle at the proper angle, the anatomical landmarks marked, the resident's voice steady as he narrated the procedure to the attending. But his hands were moving too fast, the kind of fast that came from nervousness rather than confidence, and the needle was going to miss the subclavian vein by approximately 6 mm if the angle didn't correct in the next 2 seconds. Hannah was passing Trauma Bay 2 to deliver the crash cart backup supplies when she saw it. Her hands moved. She didn't decide to move them. The decision had been made 3 years ago in Kandahar by a surgical team that had trained her muscle memory until it ran deeper than conscious thought. She was beside Dr. Webb in 2 steps, her voice pitched low and certain, redirect 5 degrees anterior. The resident's hands froze. Dr. Webb's head turned toward Hannah with the confusion of someone being corrected by nursing staff in a teaching hospital where the hierarchy was absolute. But Hannah's voice carried a weight that transcended her scrubs. It carried the weight of someone who'd been right about these decisions before, whose hands had been steady while explosions were still echoing through open surgical fields. Dr. Webb adjusted the needle's angle 5 degrees. The catheter slid into place with the subtle resistance that indicated correct positioning. The resident exhaled slowly. Hannah had already turned to leave, her work complete, when Dr. Caldwell arrived in the trauma bay behind her. He'd been on his way to review the case anyway, but he caught the tail end of the interaction, the adjustment, the redirect, the way this night shift nurse had overstepped protocol and corrected his resident without asking permission. His eyes narrowed. He watched Hannah leave the trauma bay, noting the way she moved. Precise. Efficient. Like someone trained in something other than emergency nursing. Like someone who'd been somewhere that demanded a different kind of precision than a civilian hospital could teach. Like someone who was far more than she appeared to be. Dr. Caldwell had spent 23 years building a reputation on knowing exactly who was beneath him in the institutional hierarchy. It was how he maintained control. But he'd misread something about this nurse, and that bothered him more than it should have. He made a mental note to review her file. Personnel records. Educational background. Security clearance history, if she had one. There was something underneath her surface that didn't match her nursing credentials, and Dr. Caldwell didn't tolerate mysteries in his department. The night shifted toward its middle hours. The drunk college kid stopped throwing up and dozed in Bay 7. The appendicitis patient made it to surgery without complication. A 72-year-old woman came in with chest pain that the EKG confirmed was not cardiac. The ER settled into that strange calm that happened around midnight when the night shift proper had begun and the chaos of evening transitions had subsided. Hannah worked the floor. She checked vital signs on 3 patients, restocked medication carts, helped transfer a confused dementia patient back to their bed after they'd tried to leave against medical advice. She spoke in the careful way she'd perfected over 3 years, deferential to resident physicians, attentive to other nurses, invisible to Dr. Caldwell except when he was watching her specifically, which happened every time he made rounds. At 23:41, a new patient arrived via ambulance. 41-year-old male, motor vehicle accident, moderate trauma, stable vitals. Hannah was assigned to help with intake and initial stabilization. She established an for-access line with 1 attempt, a skill that looked like luck but was actually the result of muscle memory and the ability to visualize vasculature beneath skin the way other people visualized maps. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, watched her work and said nothing, which was the highest form of approval in an ER. No interference meant confidence. No comments meant respect. Hannah finished the 4 setup and helped position the patient on the trauma monitor. She arranged the supplies within the patient's bed space according to the same system, reachable, logical, built for crisis. The patient was stable enough that tonight, he wouldn't need the crash cart. Tomorrow night might be different. Every patient might be 1 intervention away from cardiac arrest, and Hannah believed in being ready. Dr. Caldwell appeared at the foot of the patient's bed while Hannah was documenting vitals into the electronic medical record. He didn't speak to her directly. Instead, he addressed Dr. Chen. The night shift seems adequately staffed. Dr. Chen, who was reviewing imaging on the trauma monitor, responded without looking up, Hannah's a solid resource. How long has she been with us? Caldwell asked, the question casual in a way that Hannah understood was not casual at all. She continued typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she applied to everything. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge the conversation. She was aware that her ears had fixed on Caldwell's voice with the same hypervigilance that had kept her alive in Kandahar, but her hands remained steady and her expression remained neutral. 3 years, I think, Dr. Chen said. Maybe 3.5. She came from a military background. Good instincts. Caldwell's eyes traveled across Hannah's profile, the straight line of her jaw, the scars on her forearms that could have been anything, the way her hands didn't shake even in the presence of institutional authority. Military background, he repeated, and something in his tone shifted. Something that made the room temperature drop by a degree that had nothing to do with the actual thermostat. Everyone has a background, Dr. Chen. The question is what they do with it. He left the trauma bay. Hannah's fingers continued typing. The patient's oxygen saturation was 97% on room air. His heart rate was 84 and steady. His blood pressure was 118/72, which was excellent for someone who'd just survived a car accident. Everything was stable. Everything was under control. She just didn't know that control was about to become a luxury she no longer had access to. She didn't know that Dr. Caldwell was already planning to review her file. She didn't know that his phone call to the board would happen in 67 hours and change everything. The night shift continued. Rain hammered against the ER bay windows like applause for a performance nobody in the building understood they were watching. Hannah Clarke, the night shift nurse with the slight limp and the faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining, moved through Seattle General's corridors doing exactly what she'd been trained to do, keeping people alive while making it look effortless. The same way she'd done it for 12 years before the medical discharge. The same way she'd been doing it for 3 years since she'd stopped being Major Hannah Clarke and became just Hannah, the has-been who organized crash carts in a way nobody could quite explain, whose hands never trembled, whose presence made the air pressure change in ways the other staff couldn't articulate. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she still believed she could stay invisible if she was careful enough. The worst part was that she had no idea what was about to walk through the ER doors 48 hours from now, or what she would do when she saw him. Morning rounds began at 6:30, the kind of exhausted quiet that came before the floor truly woke. Hannah moved through the ER with her tablet, checking vitals on the patients who'd arrived overnight, a 73-year-old with chest pain, a 28-year-old with a concussion, and in bed 7, a 52-year-old man presenting with altered mental status and pupils so unequal they looked like different eyes entirely. His name was Thomas Martinez. His CT scan was scheduled for 4 hours from now. She was reading his neuroassessment when Dr. Caldwell arrived, moving through the ward like someone who owned the building, which, in a sense, he did. Chief of Surgery. 23 years on the board. His suit probably cost more than Hannah's monthly rent. Doctor, Hannah said quietly, stepping into his path with her tablet extended. Bed 7. The patient's presenting with altered mental status and unequal pupils. We need imaging now, not in 4 hours. Could be epidural hematoma. Could be stroke. Could be sepsis from a source we haven't found. Every minute. Caldwell didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at her tablet. He simply reached for the wall-mounted phone with the deliberation of someone executing a surgical strike, pressed the overhead page button, and waited for the tone. His voice came through every speaker on the floor, smooth as antiseptic spreading across a wound. Hannah the has-been to the nurse's station. Hannah the has-been. The ER froze. Not the kind of freeze where people paused, the kind where the entire floor went dead silent, where a resident's fingers stopped mid-keystroke, where a patient's family member stifled something between a laugh and a gasp. The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder in that silence, filling the space where voices should have been. Hannah stood there holding her tablet. She took one measured breath, and a single tear escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Caldwell, without looking away from the expression on his face, satisfaction spreading like an infection through someone's bloodstream. The nickname echoed through 3 hallways. Nurses looked down at their stations. A tech pretended to focus intently on a label maker. Nobody met her eyes. She said nothing. Not a word. she simply returned to bed 7 and placed an order for an immediate CT scan under her own clinical judgment, knowing he would override it, knowing the patient would deteriorate in 4 hours, knowing the entire floor had just heard what their hierarchy was supposed to be. She was the has-been. She was the one who didn't belong. By that afternoon, her shoulders carried the weight of every silent glance. Caldwell found her in the supply closet at 3:16 p.m., 3 p.m. 47, the time stamped on her shift notes, the moment everything crystallized into something harder than fear. He blocked the door with his body, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting ever could. "I've already spoken to the board about your performance issues." His words came out like a scalpel, each one placed with surgical precision. "You question my protocols one more time, and I'm restricting your access to critical cases. Do you understand, or do I need to use smaller words for someone who couldn't cut it in her previous career?" Hannah stood surrounded by boxes of sterile gauze and for tubing, her presence so completely contained that she seemed to occupy less space than her body actually took up. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from the nervous nurse the floor had heard all morning. "I understand perfectly, Doctor." Crystal clear. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He'd expected something: tears, anger, an apology, anything he could use. Instead he got a woman standing motionless in a supply closet, meeting his eyes with a kind of calm that made the air pressure change. Like she was the predator and he'd just realized it too late. He left without another word. The next morning arrived like an execution scheduled in advance. Shift change happened in the parking lot at Seattle General, where arriving staff climbed out of cars and heading toward the ER entrance. At least 15 people, nurses, doctors, residents, a respiratory tech, someone from admitting, moving through the pre-dawn cold with coffee in their hands and exhaustion in their eyes. Caldwell waited until the crowd was substantial. Then he announced it. "Effective immediately, Hannah Clarke is being reassigned to overnight triage," he said, his voice carrying across the asphalt like he was delivering something important to the assembled crew. "There have been concerning judgment calls, and we need to ensure she works within our established hierarchy. Night shifts, triage only, supervised intake protocols. I'm sure the transition will be smooth." A resident whispered to another that the has-been finally got demoted. Someone's laugh cut off mid-note. Hannah stood there holding her coffee in a styrofoam cup, coffee that had gone lukewarm during the drive-in, watching her professional reputation shatter in front of colleagues whose eyes suddenly found the pavement very interesting. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She took one measured breath, the kind soldiers took before breaching doors, and responded with a voice so calm it sounded almost conversational. "I've saved lives in places you couldn't pronounce, Doctor." Each word landed with the weight of something true. "I'll survive a night shift." Caldwell's smile widened. The kind of smile that thought it had won. "Let's hope your survival rate improves here." The crowd dispersed toward the building. Hannah stood in the parking lot with her coffee and her demotion and her limp slightly more pronounced than usual, moving with the kind of precision that came from calculating angles and distances, from being trained to move through hostile territory without breaking formation. She walked past all of them, 15 pairs of eyes that wouldn't meet hers, and clocked in for her first overnight shift knowing she'd been exiled to the hospital's Siberia. But that wasn't the worst part. The overnight shift stretched thin and quiet. Hannah worked triage alone, processing minor injuries and routine admissions, a woman with gastroenteritis, a man with a sprained ankle, a child with an ear infection. The kind of cases that didn't matter. The kind of cases that asked nothing of her except documentation and basic vitals. She'd been a major in special forces. She'd coordinated medical operations across Kandahar province. She'd extracted 12 wounded soldiers under fire and written incident reports that changed military policy. Now she was triaging ankle sprains at midnight. At 11:04 p.m., 2 federal agents walked through the ER doors escorting a patient under armed guard. The agents were precisely what you'd expect: earpieces visible, hands positioned near concealed weapons, eyes that moved constantly, mapping exits and distances with the kind of automatic awareness that came from spending years in protective services. The patient between them was an older man, maybe 60, with the bearing of someone used to authority. Grey at the temples. Expensive watch. The kind of medical transfer that didn't happen at Seattle General very often. Protected witness, the intake paperwork said. Armed escort. Credible threats against his life. Hannah received the paperwork with her hand steady and her face neutral. Then she saw the name, and her composure fractured for exactly 1 second. Colonel James Morrison. The world didn't stop. That only happened in stories, but Hannah's breath did, caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. 3 years of careful invisibility, 3 years of moving through crowds without being seen, 3 years of deferring to residents and suffering Caldwell's mockery, all of it hinged on one foundational lie, that nobody here knew who she really was. Morrison's eyes widened with recognition simultaneously. Clarke. His voice sounded hoarse, surprised, containing something that might have been regret. Hannah didn't correct him with her rank. She simply nodded and began the intake assessment with the kind of professional detachment that came from muscle memory, accessing the 4 line on his right arm with a 20-gauge angiocath needle, the kind of fluid motion that looked simple and contained everything she'd learned in 15 years of medicine. Her hands were steady. Her pulse hammered in her ears like distant artillery. One of the federal agents explained in clipped tones that Morrison was a protected witness in a military corruption case, that credible threats had been made, that he was here for emergency gallbladder surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning, and that security protocols required him to remain under constant observation in the ICU. Hannah processed the bitter mathematics of the situation. She was now assigned to keep alive the man who'd stood in front of a tribunal in Kandahar and called her emotionally unstable. Unsuited for command. Prone to compromising military objectives with excessive concern for civilian casualties. That testimony had ended her career. This man had been the instrument. Morrison tried to speak to her privately while the agent stepped away to coordinate with security. His voice carried something that sounded like regret. Clarke, I need to tell you what really happened after you were. Let's focus on your vital signs, Colonel, Hannah said, her voice clinical and precise, cutting him off with the kind of efficiency that suggested this conversation wasn't happening. She transferred him to the ICU herself, documented his arrival with medical accuracy, and requested reassignment to a different patient. The night supervisor denied it. You're the only RN with the security clearance for protected witnesses, she said. I know it's complicated, but it's just one night. Surgeries at 7 a.m. Just one night. Hannah clocked in for the ICU and set up Morrison's monitors with practiced precision, the cardiac leads, the pulse oximetry, the blood pressure cuff cycling automatically every 15 minutes. Morrison tried again while she worked. I need to tell you what really happened. Your vitals are stable, Hannah said without looking at him. She checked the 4 line, verified the pharmacy had his pre-op medications queued, and documented everything with the kind of accuracy that suggested she was performing surgery with her pen. Try to rest. At 1:44 a.m., the ICU's motion sensors detected movement in the stairwell adjacent to Morrison's room. Security radios crackled with urgent voices. 2 men in tactical gear had bypassed the 3rd-floor checkpoint, and nobody seemed to know how long they'd been inside the building before the alarm triggered. Hannah was standing at the medication cart when the call came through. She heard boots on the stairwell. Real boots. Combat-trained movement. The kind of sound that didn't belong in a hospital. The kind of sound that meant everything was about to change. The stairwell door crashed open at 11:27 p.m. Hannah heard it from the triage station, not the soft pneumatic hiss of the normal ER entrance, but a metallic slam that echoed through the west corridor like a gunshot chambering. 2 figures in dark tactical gear emerged from the stairwell, their movement synchronized and precise, earpieces visible, hands positioned with the practiced ease of people who knew exactly where their concealed weapons rested. Federal agents. Not hospital security. Not city police. The kind of personnel who didn't announce themselves with radios or protocol. She didn't look up from the patient intake form she wasn't actually reading. Looking up would be a mistake. Looking up would signal recognition, and recognition would signal that she understood exactly what kind of protection detail this was, and why it mattered, and what it meant that they were moving through her hospital at this hour with that particular controlled intensity. Instead, Hannah kept her pen moving across the form, her shoulders loose, her breathing steady. The art of invisibility she'd perfected 3 years ago, the one that let her exist in rooms where she didn't belong. Witness transport. ICU West Isolation Protocol, the first agent said into his radio. His voice carried the flat, mechanical quality of someone delivering the 100th briefing of his career. Security perimeter established. No unauthorized personnel beyond checkpoint. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the surgical wing 30 seconds later, his white coat crisp and his expression already calculating. He'd been monitoring the ER traffic through his administrative access. He always did, always needed to know who was moving through his territory and why. The agents didn't acknowledge him. He wasn't on the clearance list. Hannah watched him process that fact, watched the small twitch at his jaw when he realized his authority had just been superseded by something he couldn't control. Some men learned humility from moments like that. Caldwell would learn resentment instead. The night shift supervisor approached Hannah's station, her face carefully neutral in the way that meant she'd been briefed by federal authorities and was trying very hard not to show it. "We're moving you to ICU isolation support. Room for 47. Your primary care for the incoming patient. Non-negotiable security clearance already on file from your military service. Federal agents will brief you in person." Hannah's pen didn't hesitate. Neither did her voice. "Understood. You can't discuss the patient's identity with anyone. Not your friends, not the doctors, not the other nurses. Not your family. The agents will explain the full protocols when you arrive upstairs." "Copy." She stood. Clipped her badge back to her scrubs. Moved toward the elevator with the measured pace of someone who had spent thousands of hours moving through hospitals, not too fast, not the kind of speed that drew attention, just the simple forward momentum of doing the next task in a long chain of tasks that would never really end. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in the color of exhaustion and antiseptic. The 2 federal agents were waiting at the ICU entrance on the 4th floor. 1 male, 1 female, both with the particular kind of stillness that came from professional training and the understanding that most people would try to get information from them eventually. The female agent held a clipboard that Hannah recognized as a SCIF briefing form, sensitive compartmented information facility clearance documentation. Her old life, coming to collect a debt it never asked permission to incur. "Major Clarke," the agent said. Not a question. Just a statement of fact that hung in the air between them like humidity before a storm. Hannah's breath steadied. The voice was still deferential, still soft, still perfectly calibrated to suggest she was someone small enough to be dismissed. That was a long time ago. 12 minutes ago the witness was still en route. "You have a clean record since discharge. No security violations, no attempts to contact classified sources, no red flags. You're cleared for level for isolation support. The patient will be your responsibility for the next 72 hours minimum, possibly longer." "I understand." "Do you?" the male agent asked. His eyes were the color of winter rain. "Because the last time you saw this patient, you were testifying that he'd ordered the execution of 14 civilians and attempted to falsify the investigation. Do you understand what we're asking you to do?" Hannah understood perfectly. She understood that the universe had a sense of timing so precise it felt like malice. She understood that some debts couldn't be paid by walking away, that some ghosts followed even when you changed your name on a clipboard, changed your uniform into scrubs, changed everything about the way you moved through the world except the part that still knew how to recognize a voice giving orders that got people killed. "Yes," she said. "I understand. Room for 47. Your badge will override the access panel. The patient will arrive within 15 minutes. We maintain a perimeter outside the room at all times. You communicate through the call button, no direct radio, no pager traffic. No documentation that he's here. His vitals go to the federal monitors. If there's a medical crisis, you call us first, the code team second. That's not standard protocol. No. It isn't. The agents bracketed the isolation room entrance as Hannah stepped inside. Room 447 was exactly like every other ICU room in this hospital, the same cardiac monitor with its intimidating array of colored wires, the same ventilator standing sentinel in the corner like a chrome prayer, the same cooling blankets and pressure for stands and fluorescent lights that made everything look like it was being slowly erased. She checked the equipment, confirmed the medication lockout codes, verified the emergency supplies were precisely where they should be. Her hands moved through the process automatically while her mind worked several steps ahead, the way it always did in crisis. The sound of the transport gurney came before she saw him. Wheels squeaking against polished floor. EMT voices reciting vitals to the federal agents. The rustle of an ambulance blanket being transferred to the hospital bed. And then Hannah looked down at the face of the man they were asking her to save, and every single piece of composure she'd built over 3 years shattered like a dropped surgical tray. Colonel James Morrison. 37 years old. Former commander of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. The man who'd sat across from her in the JAG office in Kandahar and delivered testimony that had contradicted her sworn statement about civilian casualties in Jolan district. The man whose words had transformed her from a decorated major with a combat record into a discharged veteran with a career dissolution and a classified file the size of a dictionary. The man whose order had gotten 12 civilians killed and whose testimony had destroyed her before the discharge board could even pronounce her name correctly. His eyes opened slightly. Recognition flickered across his face, the terrible, knowing recognition of someone who'd just understood that the universe was about to collect on every debt he'd ever owed in full. Hannah's hand trembled. Just for 1 second. Just enough that Morrison would see it, that he would understand that she understood exactly what this meant, that the federal government had placed him in the medical care of the one person in Philadelphia who had every reason to let him die. She steadied her fingers. Checked his full line. Confirmed his cardiac rhythm on the monitor, sinus tachycardia, elevated but within range for transport stress. The professional mask slid back into place like a knife finding its sheath. Her voice, when she spoke, was precisely calibrated to suggest she was someone who could be trusted to do her job. Vital stable from transport. Cardiac monitor shows normal sinus rhythm with mild tachycardia. I'm establishing ICU protocols. She didn't look at his face again. Not yet. Not while she was still deciding whether she could trust herself in this room with him for the next 72 hours. You need to rest. I'll be monitoring you all night. The federal agent stood their watch outside. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm. And Hannah Clarke, Major, Special Forces, medically discharged, sat in the isolation room with the man who'd testified against her and prepared to save his life even if it killed her to do it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she already knew exactly what was going to happen at 2 a.m. The clock above the ICU nurse's station showed 1:06 a.m. when Hannah heard it, the sound of the ER entrance doors slamming open 5 floors below, followed by boots moving with military precision through the corridors. Not hospital security. These footsteps carried weight, authority, the kind of cadence that came from units that trained together for years. She knew that rhythm. She'd walked in that rhythm for 12 years. 2 minutes later, the ICU doors burst inward without a knock. 2 men in black tactical gear swept through the entryway with weapons raised, moving like water through a room, their eyes scanning beds with the targeting discipline of operators who'd done this in Kandahar, in Fallujah, in places where mistakes meant body bags. Their assault rifles tracked left, then right, then locked onto the bed in the corner where Colonel Morrison lay sedated under a ventilator, his Secret Service detail already dead or unconscious in the stairwell below. Hannah's body moved before her brain could process the decision. Combat training doesn't live in conscious thought, it lives in muscle memory, in the neural pathways scorched by 1,000 emergency drills. She crossed the distance between her medication cart and Morrison's bed in 3 seconds, positioning herself in front of the mattress like a human shield, her hands already reaching for the crash cart to pull it closer for cover. Her voice didn't break when she screamed for lockdown. It cut through the ICU like a drill sergeant's command, sharp and authoritative and nothing like the deferential nurse who'd been silenced for 3 days. The first gunman fired without hesitation. The sound was wrong, muffled suppressors, which meant professionals, which meant this wasn't random. The rounds came in controlled bursts, 3-shot groups, the kind of precision fire taught only at elite training facilities. Hannah felt the first impact like being hit with a sledgehammer wrapped in fire. Chest. Left side. The bullet punched through her ribs and kept going, collapsing her lung like a punctured balloon. She didn't cry out. Didn't stumble. Kept her body between the weapon and Morrison's bed as the second burst came. 2 more rounds. Shoulder, abdomen. Her vision sparked with the kind of pain that comes from damage to major organs, but adrenaline is a powerful narcotic and she'd learned years ago to separate pain from function. Pain is information. Pain is data. Process it later. Keep breathing now. The 5th round caught her low, below the surgical scar tissue from the IED shrapnel that had ended her first career. Her abdomen erupted in white-hot agony. 2 gunshot wounds to the same damaged area. Cruel mathematics. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her vision was already tunneling, her body going into hemorrhagic shock as her arterial pressure plummeted, and she still had exactly 4 minutes of useful consciousness left. She knew the math. 1.5 liters of blood loss and counting. She could feel it pooling beneath her scrubs, warm and electric and draining her capacity for speech with every breath that bubbled up from the collapsed lung. Security erupted through the ICU doors, 5 officers in ballistic vests with pistols drawn, and the gunman pivoted toward them. Rounds exploded in the ICU like firecrackers in a metal box. One of the shooters went down hard, arterial spray fontaining from his neck. The other tried to retreat toward the stairwell, but security cut him off with a wall of gunfire that sent him backward into the medication station. Morrison's hands were shaking. His voice was a whisper through the ventilator circuit. "Hannah, Hannah, I can't." She pulled the jacket open with the last of her motor control, the one that had the faded Special Forces patch stitched into the lining. Inside the pocket was the thing she'd carried through 3 years of humiliation, through every shift where she'd been invisible. She kept them in her jacket because soldiers understand that you carry your unit home in whatever way you can. An MRE wrapper, the waterproofed plastic from a flameless ration heater, the kind she'd used 1,000 times in field conditions when blood wouldn't stop bleeding and there was no proper trauma tape and you had to improvise with what the military gave you. Morrison. Her voice was steady. It didn't sound like the voice of someone bleeding out. That was training. That was the thing Dr. Caldwell would never understand, when you've held someone's arteries together in the dark while incoming fire hammered the FOB perimeter, a hospital crisis is just another drill you've already done. Listen to me. Press this wrapper against the wound on my shoulder. Hard. Don't think. Just pressure. His hands moved. They were trembling, but they moved. Security was neutralizing the scene, calling for additional trauma teams, and Hannah's hearing was getting watery at the edges, but she kept talking, kept her voice steady even as the darkness started creeping in from the corners of her vision. The one on my left side. Underneath. Feel that? That's pressure. Apply the wrapper. Now your hand. Push. Morrison was crying. She could hear it in his breathing, in the fractured whispers beneath the ventilator hiss. But his hands were doing the work. He'd been trained 2 years ago, before the medals and the politics. His fingers found the wound and pressed, and Hannah could feel the pressure building inside her chest like the air pressure changing before a thunderstorm. Don't let go. Even now. Even as her BP monitor was screaming warnings at the nurses who'd flooded the ICU. Even as she could feel her heart racing to compensate for the blood it no longer had. Stay with me, Colonel. Don't let go. The ambulance is coming. Stay with me. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 years ago, Morrison's testimony had destroyed her career. His words to a military tribunal had made sure she'd never wear the uniform again, never lead a team, never go back to the only thing that made sense. And now she was using the last of her conscious moments to keep him alive, to make sure his hand stayed steady, to give him the one thing she'd spent 3 years trying to rebuild for herself. Purpose. The trauma surgeons burst into the ICU with transport equipment, and Hannah was moving, no, being moved, and Morrison's hands came away from her wounds covered in her blood. A nurse called out vitals that sounded like they were coming from underwater, BP 62/38 and dropping. O2 sat 71. Heart rate 168. 2 collapsed lungs, probable perforated viscera. The crash cart was rolling. The fluorescent lights above her bed blurred into a singular white streak as they moved her toward the elevator. Hannah's vision was nearly gone now, just a narrow tunnel of awareness shrinking at the edges, and she forced out one final sentence through a throat full of blood, "Don't lose him, because I—" But the words didn't finish. Her body had reached the limit of its negotiation with physics. The elevator doors hissed closed and she was gone into the machinery of emergency surgery, the place where her medical training would mean absolutely nothing because the patient was her, and her hands couldn't save her anymore. Only someone else's hands. Only faith that the training they'd given her about keeping people alive actually worked when she was the one on the table. The recovery room smelled like copper and antiseptic, a combination that had defined Hannah's entire adult life but felt different now, sharper, more present, when it was her own blood mixing with the chemical burn of hospital disinfectant. She woke to the weight of bandages across her chest, shoulder, and abdomen, the kind of pressure that came from trauma surgery and careful field dressing. 2 collapsed lungs. A perforated intestine. Massive internal bleeding controlled by a surgeon whose hands had moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before. Not Caldwell. Never Caldwell. Someone competent. The clock on the wall read 6:36 a.m. She'd been under for 4 hours. The four line in her left arm dripped clear fluid, and her right shoulder screamed with every shallow breath, the kind of pain that was information, data about tissue damage and nerve endings firing in sequence. A catheter tugged at her bladder. Oxygen hummed through nasal cannula. All of it felt familiar because she'd been on the other side of these machines before, watching other people float in and out of consciousness, assessing their odds by the color of their lips and the rhythm of their breathing. A nurse, someone she didn't recognize, younger, with genuine concern in her eyes, appeared in her peripheral vision. "Major Clarke, don't try to move. You've got 3 chest tubes and abdominal packing. You're stable, but barely. The surgeons want you immobilized for at least 48 hours. Hannah wanted to laugh. 48 hours was how long it took to know if a patient would actually make it or if the initial surgery was just delaying the inevitable. 48 hours was the difference between survival and a convincing lie told to the family. She didn't laugh. She didn't speak. Speaking required breath control, and breath control felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The nurse adjusted the foredrip and left, rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum tile in a rhythm that sounded like Morse code. Boots. Boots had a different sound, more deliberate, heavier with purpose. She wondered if Morrison was still in the ICU upstairs or if the federal agents had moved him somewhere safer. She wondered if they'd told him she'd taken 5 rounds meant for his chest. She wondered if he'd care. The door opened again, and Dr. Caldwell entered with a kind of professional composure that was pure theater, the white coat pristine, the ID badge catching the fluorescent light, his face arranged into an expression of surgical concern that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him were 2 hospital administrators she recognized and a man with a legal pad who looked like he'd been trained by someone who specialized in institutional damage control. "Major Clarke," Caldwell began, and the rank in his mouth sounded like an insult. "I'm here to discuss the incident from this morning. We need to understand exactly what happened and why you deviated from standard protocol." Hannah's eyes moved to him, but her body didn't shift. Moving hurt. Breathing hurt. Talking would hurt worst of all, so she didn't. "You were assigned to provide basic monitoring," Caldwell continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining simple facts to someone simple. "When the threat occurred, protocol mandates immediate evacuation to a secure location. Instead, you positioned yourself between the patient and the gunfire. That's not heroic, Major. That's escalation. That's endangering hospital staff. The man with the legal pad was writing. The administrators were exchanging glances that said they'd been briefed on what Caldwell was about to do and had already decided the outcome. I'm launching a full internal investigation, Caldwell said, the words falling into the room like stones. I'm reviewing your actions, your medical decisions, your judgment under pressure. And I'm recommending that this investigation be expanded to determine whether your military background predisposed you to violence and confrontation. Hannah's jaw tightened. She wanted to speak. The training wanted her to speak, to defend, to explain, to counter his narrative with facts. But the surgeon's work was still fresh. The sutures were still setting. And speaking meant moving her diaphragm, which meant pressure on the repair site, which meant bleeding, which meant intubation, which meant surrender. So she didn't speak. She held his gaze instead, and watched something flicker across his face, frustration that his accusations didn't land, irritation that she wasn't defending herself, the first hint of concern that silence might be a stronger position than words. I'm reassigning Dr. Patterson and Nurse Rivera from the investigative committee, he said, naming the two people most likely to support her. Dr. Hayes will chair the investigation with my direct oversight. We need objectivity, not sympathy. He turned to leave, then paused. You're on restricted duty pending the outcome. No patient contact. No access to critical cases. When you're cleared to walk, report to the administrative office for statement review. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The nurses returned 15 minutes later with a meal tray, broth, because solid food was still a risk, and Hannah didn't eat. She stared at the clear cup of soup and thought about Morrison bleeding out under her hands, about the MRE wrapper she'd used to seal his chest wound, about the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining that was now somewhere in a hospital locker, probably being catalogued as evidence. 36 hours later, Hannah was discharged to outpatient care with a stack of prescriptions and follow-up appointments, all scheduled with Caldwell's office despite her protests. The wounds were healing. The surgeons had removed one of the 3 chest tubes. The internal bleeding had stopped. By every metric that mattered, she was going to live. By every metric that mattered to her, she was already dead. She walked out of Seattle General at dusk on a Thursday, moving like someone learning their body all over again. Each step was a negotiation between her brain's memory of how to walk and her body's reality of fresh surgical trauma. The parking lot was grey concrete and yellow lines, and the rain started falling the moment she stepped through the automatic doors as if the sky had been waiting for her exit. The cardboard box was light in her hands. That was the worst part, somehow. Everything that mattered fit in a box so light that grief felt insufficient to hold it. Her cracked favorite mug, the ceramic chipped along the rim from being washed by hospital dishwashers 1,000 times. A dying succulent from her desk, already browning at the edges, slowly returning to the dust it came from. And a photograph, her and 11 other soldiers in desert camouflage, taken in Kandahar 3 weeks before the IED that changed everything. Their faces were young and hard and certain that they'd come home the same way they left. 3 of them hadn't come home at all. The termination letter was in her scrub pocket, already memorized. Effective immediately. Gross negligence. Endangering staff. A recommendation against rehire at any facility within the Seattle General Hospital network. Caldwell had attached a summary of the preliminary investigation findings, a timeline that placed her actions minutes before the gunman arrived, a narrative that suggested she'd somehow caused the crisis through her presence alone, a conclusion that her military background and demonstrated tendency toward confrontational resolution made her unsuitable for a healthcare environment. She stood at a bus stop under an awning that did nothing to stop the rain from driving sideways. The box sat on the metal bench beside her. Her phone had 3 missed calls from Morrison's number, and she'd ignored them all. She had a sister in Denver she hadn't spoken to in 18 months. She had $12,400 in a savings account. She had a lease on an apartment that required payment in 9 days. She had a photograph of people who died so that she could live, and they still weren't as dead as she felt right now. The phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text, not a call. Seattle General main entrance. 0900 tomorrow. You'll want to be there. Hannah stared at the message for a long moment, then turned the phone off. Whoever sent it would understand. Whoever sent it already knew that she wasn't interested in vindication or justice or any of the things that civilians believed mattered at the end. She'd already survived the worst. Everything else was just wind and rain and the slow work of breathing through pain that would eventually fade into scar tissue. The bus arrived at 8:33 p.m., and Hannah Clarke, Major in the United States Special Forces, got on carrying everything she owned into the Seattle night, while 75 soldiers were already booking flights, already mobilizing, already preparing to bring one of their own in from the cold. She didn't know that yet. But in 48 hours, she would. If you made it this far, you know there's more to this story. Subscribe now, because what happens at Seattle General tomorrow morning will change everything, and you won't want to miss the moment this hospital realizes exactly who they let walk out the door. Like this video if you believe in standing up for your people, comment below with what you would have done in Hannah's position, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the reckoning that's coming.